Richard Kuklinski is one of the most dangerous criminals we have ever come across in this state.
He was convicted of multiple murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. This ended 30 years of cold-blooded killing by a masked criminal police called the Iceman.
Nothing haunts me. Nothing. I don't think about it. If I think about it, it would wind up hurting me. So I don't think about it. If I had a choice, I would like to be different than what I am. It would be better. But I can't change yesterday. When I was a young man, I found out that if you hurt somebody, they'll leave you alone. Good guys do finish last. When I tried to leave everybody alone, just do my own thing, everybody just wanted to hurt me. I tried to provide the best for them as I knew how.
Some people still argue about what Richard Kuklinski really was. Was he a mafia hitman who killed for money, or a serial killer who murdered because he wanted to? When you look closely at his life, that debate almost doesn't matter. The reality is that one man left a trail of bodies behind him that stretched from his childhood in New Jersey to back alleys and bar parking lots across America. This is the story of how an unwanted little boy, born into violence, humiliation, and fear, grew into one of the most prolific and sadistic killers in modern American history. Richard's story begins long before he ever picked up a weapon. It starts with two deeply damaged people who should never have been parents. His father, Stanley Kuklinski, was a Polish immigrant who worked as a brakeman on the railroad. The job was hard, the pay was poor, and Stanley's way of coping was to drink heavily. Alcohol didn't relax him, it turned him into something feral. When he drank, he didn't just raise his voice or slam a door. He kicked, punched, and beat the people in his house until they were bloody, then went to work the next day as if nothing had happened. Richard's mother, Anna, carried her own scars. She had been raised in an orphanage after her parents died, and instead of protection, she found horror there. As a child, she was abused by the very people who were supposed to care for her. Priests and nuns who used religion as a mask for cruelty. By the time she left that place, she believed two things with absolute certainty: that God was something to be feared, and that suffering was simply the way life worked. She brought both beliefs into her marriage. When Stanley met Anna, she was young, attractive, and eager for a family of her own. Within a few months, they were married. The fairy tale ended almost immediately. Stanley was possessive and jealous, and every tiny perceived insult, another man looking at Anna, dinner being late, a neighbor's comment, could set him off. He would beat his wife, rape her, and then expect her to act like a dutiful spouse the next morning. Divorce, to Anna, wasn't even an idea she could entertain. In the Catholic world, she knew you endured. So she endured. Their first child, a boy named Florian, did nothing to soften Stanley. The beatings continued, shifting from wife to son and back again, flowing to wherever his anger happened to land. When Anna became pregnant again, it likely wasn't out of love or even mutual desire. It was just another consequence of a violent man taking what he wanted. On April 11th, 1935, she gave birth to their second son, Richard Leonard Kuklinski. From the moment he was old enough to understand anything at all, Richard understood fear. He learned very quickly that the sound of his father's boots at the door meant pain was coming. Stanley could go from silence to rage in seconds, and the little boy never knew what might set him off. A dish not washed, a toy left out, a child looking at him the wrong way. Richard's body reacted before his brain did. His muscles tensed, his stomach knotted, and more often than not, he wet himself in terror the second his father walked into the room. That, of course, only brought more beatings. Stanley had a favorite tool, a leather belt wrapped around his fist so that each punch was amplified by steel buckle and hardened leather. He would hammer it into his sons' heads and bodies until one of them stopped moving. Sometimes he knocked them out cold on the floor. There was no comforting embrace afterward, no apology, no lesson. There was just a drunk man catching his breath and a child learning that the world was a place where pain arrived without warning. Anna did little to stop it. At first, she tried to intervene, but that only redirected the violence onto her. Eventually, she settled into a grim routine. She kept the house clean, went to church, said her prayers, and pretended not to see what was happening right in front of her. Her faith twisted into something harsh and unforgiving. When she hit the children, she hit them in the name of discipline, of God, of teaching them right. To Richard, his mother's hands felt no kinder than his father's. In 1941, when Richard was just 5, the fragile balance inside that tiny apartment snapped. One winter day, Stanley lost his temper with 7-year-old Florian. No one knows exactly what started it. A broken item, a childish mistake, or perhaps nothing at all. Stanley beat his eldest son savagely, striking the back of the boy's head again and again until he finally stopped breathing. There was no frantic attempt at CPR, no ambulance called. Stanley simply realized what he'd done and moved to cover it up. He forced Anna to lie to the authorities, to claim that Florian had fallen down the stairs. The story was accepted without question, and the dead child was brought back to the apartment in a coffin for the wake. For hours, little Richard stood beside the wooden box and tried to wake his brother, whispering, shaking, begging him to get up. Someone told him Florian had been hit by a car. Someone else said he was with God. But Richard already knew the truth, even if he couldn't put it into words. His father had killed his brother, and nobody was going to do anything about it. The message that sank into that 5-year-old mind was devastating. The world was not just unfair, it was rigged. The person who hurt you the most would never be punished. The people who were supposed to protect you looked away. Love, tenderness, safety. Those were things he saw in movies or heard about in church sermons, not things he actually felt. Inside, something cold began to form. With Florian gone, Richard became the primary target for Stanley's rages. The beatings grew more frequent and more vicious. Bruises and cuts kept him out of school for days at a time. When he did make it to class, he arrived thin, exhausted, and dressed in worn-out clothes that marked him instantly as poor. The other children were merciless. They mocked his appearance, his quietness, his odd last name. They shoved him, tripped him, laughed at him when he tried to fight back and lost. At home he was weak. Outside he was weak. There was nowhere to escape. More children arrived. A little sister, Roberta, and a younger brother, Joseph. The tiny apartment that already felt suffocating became even more cramped. Money was tighter than ever, and Stanley's response was the same as always: drink more, hurt more. He brought women home in front of his family, bragging and groping them as if his wife and children were invisible. Richard watched all of this with a growing hatred that had nowhere to go. He fantasized, even as a boy, about killing his father. He imagined stabbing him in his sleep or shooting him in the face. But he also knew what happened to children who crossed Stanley. They ended up in coffins. Eventually, Stanley drifted out of the household, spending more and more nights with other women, leaving Anna to hold together a family she was barely emotionally equipped to handle. Without her husband's shadow looming over her, a new side of her emerged, but it wasn't a gentle one. The years of abuse and religious guilt hardened into something like stone. She became strict, controlling and quick to anger, wielding whatever object was closest, broom, pan, hairbrush, as a weapon to discipline her kids. To cope, Anna clung even harder to the church. She tried to drill fear of God into her children, the way fear of Stanley had been drilled into her. Richard was forced to serve as an altar boy, wear the robe, attend mass, repeat prayers. But the church he saw from the inside looked disturbingly similar to the world he already knew. The nuns were cruel, the priests handsy and inappropriate, their supposed holiness a thin cover for petty power and hypocrisy. Any respect he might have had for religion rotted into the same kind of rage he felt toward his parents. To young Richard, authority in any form meant only one thing: danger. When Stanley finally disappeared for good, the family's finances collapsed. Bills piled up. There wasn't enough food. Anna, desperate and overwhelmed, could no longer play both saint and enforcer. Someone had to put food on the table, and the only person available was a skinny, angry boy who had just started his teenage years. Richard began stealing out of necessity. At first, small things, food from stores, anything he could sneak under his coat and bring home. His mother, at least initially, responded the only way she knew how. She beat him. She hit him with whatever she could grab, screaming that stealing was a sin, that God would punish him. But hunger doesn't care about commandments, and neither do starving children. When she realized that his thefts were the only reason there was bread on the table, her attitude shifted. The beatings stopped. The stolen food was silently accepted. Richard absorbed a new lesson. Rules were flexible if breaking them kept you alive. The line between right and wrong, already hazy, blurred a little more. By then, the rage that had lived in him since infancy had nowhere safe to go. He couldn't unleash it on his father. Stanley was gone. Hitting back at his mother felt impossible. Fighting the boys at school never ended well. So his anger slid downward to the only creatures weaker than he was. Dogs, cats, strays that nobody would miss. Alone in alleyways and empty lots, Richard began to experiment with cruelty. He tied tails together. He set animals on fire just to hear them scream. He watched the way their bodies convulsed, the way life drained from their eyes, and something inside him lit up. Not guilt, not horror, but a dark, thrilling kind of power. For the first time, he wasn't the victim. He was the one deciding who suffered and when it ended. Richard Kuklinski was still just a child, but the foundation was already laid. A boy raised on beatings and lies, comforted by no one, learning that the only way to avoid being hurt was to become more frightening than the people who hurt you. In the streets of Jersey City, people saw a quiet, awkward kid with tattered clothes and a strange last name. They had no way of knowing that the mind behind those pale eyes was already beginning to think about killing. Not just in fantasies, but as a real solution, a way to fix problems, a way to finally, after a lifetime of fear, feel in control. Richard's teenage years did not bring peace. They didn't bring maturity, discipline, or empathy the way they do for most kids. Instead, those years were like gasoline poured on a fire that had been quietly burning inside him since childhood. The anger that once came from fear was now becoming something else, something colder, more deliberate, more focused, and the world around him had absolutely no idea what was growing in that quiet boy with the deadpan stare. School had become a battlefield he no longer bothered to fight in. His grades slipped, his attendance collapsed. Teachers wrote him off as slow or troubled. The truth was far more dangerous. Richard was no longer interested in fitting into society. Society had offered him nothing but pain, humiliation, and lies. He wasn't trying to belong. He was studying people, how they walked, how they talked, how they reacted when frightened. He was learning what triggered fear in others because fear was the only language he truly understood. It was around this time that Richard discovered something that would shape the rest of his life: the incredible calm he felt after hurting someone. Most people feel adrenaline when they get into fights. They shake, they sweat, they panic. Richard felt the opposite. The more violent the situation, the calmer he became. It was as if his heart slowed down. His breathing steadied, and the world around him fell into a cold, perfect focus. Pain sharpened him. Violence cleared. His mind, that alone made him different from other boys his age, and infinitely more dangerous. By 14, he had stopped being merely a victim of beatings and bullying. He began hunting the kids who had tormented him, not with childish scuffles or punches behind the schoolyard. Richard waited until they were alone, walking home, cutting through alleys, leaning against a wall with a cigarette. That's where he struck, without warning, without mercy, and without any guilt afterwards. One of the first boys he targeted was a local bully, older, bigger, someone who had humiliated Richard for years. One evening, Richard followed him to an abandoned building. Inside, the walls were cracked, the windows broken, and there was no one around to intervene. For the first time, Richard unleashed the full extent of his rage without holding back. The beating he delivered was so savage that when the boy stopped moving, Richard stared at him, not with panic, not with regret, but with curiosity. There was a strange satisfaction in watching the life drain out of someone who had once terrified him. The boy didn't die, or so the official story went. Rumors floated around the neighborhood, stories whispered behind closed doors. Some said the kid moved away, others said he ended up in a hospital for months. No one tied it to Richard, no one even suspected him, and that invisibility thrilled him. It was like discovering a superpower. He could hurt someone, nearly kill someone, and walk away without consequence. Soon, animals were no longer enough to quiet the storm inside him. He needed bigger prey, more risk, more control. He started roaming further from home, slipping into unfamiliar neighborhoods late at night. He would look for people who seemed alone, vulnerable, isolated, homeless drifters, drunks stumbling down alleys, teenagers hanging out after midnight. Jersey City was full of forgotten individuals, and Richard realized something horrifyingly simple. No one cared if the forgotten disappeared. In his later interviews, Richard admitted that the first time he killed someone intentionally, he didn't feel fear or remorse. He felt relief, like releasing pressure from a valve that had been building for years. That first killing wasn't planned. It happened because a man insulted him, called him soft, made fun of him in front of others. Richard waited until the man headed toward the walkway near the river. He followed silently, picked up a thick wooden pole, and beat him until his body went limp. Then he dragged him to the edge and rolled him into the water. No hesitation, no panic, just an overwhelming sense of calm. He walked home that night without looking back. From that moment on, killing became something else for Richard. Not just an emotional release, not just revenge. It became a tool, a solution, a way to shape the world around him when nothing else worked. Most teenagers learned how to drive, how to flirt, how to make friends. Richard learned how to stalk, how to ambush, how to silence someone forever without leaving a trace. And he liked it. At home, the situation remained toxic. Anna had grown harsher with age, her temper more unpredictable, and with Stanley gone, she needed someone to absorb her frustrations. Richard was the obvious choice. She hit him with broom handles, hurled objects at him, and screamed about morality while ignoring the bruises across his body. But by then, he was too big and too emotionally detached to fear her. He absorbed her rage the way a wall absorbs sound. No emotion, no reaction. In fact, Richard learned something valuable during those years. That emotional control was a weapon more powerful than fists. People who lose their temper make mistakes. People who panic leave evidence. People who show fear give others power. Richard did none of those things. By the time he reached adulthood, he had already become what experts would later describe as a controlled sociopath. Not the screaming, uncontrollable type, the silent, calculating, patient type, the kind that blends into a crowd until the moment he strikes. When he wasn't killing, Richard stole. He stole to feed his family. He stole to satisfy his desires. He stole because it gave him purpose. Cars, clothes, food, money, whatever he could get his hands on. He loved the adrenaline of slipping past cops and getting away with it. Even then, he understood that fear could be a form of currency. People feared him quietly, whispered about him, avoided him. That suited him perfectly. By 16, he had dropped out of school entirely. There was no point in pretending. He worked odd jobs, mostly manual labor, but he never kept them for long. He had a brutal temper when challenged and a lack of patience for authority. Employers fired him, he beat them up, and the cycle repeated. The streets became his classroom. Violence became his career. One night, in a quiet corridor of Jersey City, Richard made a decision, one that would define the rest of his life. He would never again be powerless, never again a victim, never again a scared child in a broken home. From now on, he would be the one people feared, and he was right. The world would soon learn to fear the name Richard Kuklinski. By the time Richard entered his late teens, he had two identities. One was the quiet, awkward kid from Jersey City, the one who avoided eye contact, kept his voice low and tried not to draw attention. The other was something far darker, a young predator who moved through the streets with cold confidence, dealing out violence without hesitation. Most people saw only the first version. That was their mistake. New Jersey in the 1950s was a breeding ground for organized crime. Gambling, loan sharking, hijacking, stolen goods, they were everywhere, woven into the daily life of the working class. The Mafia wasn't a distant myth. It was the neighborhood's worst-kept secret. Men who shook hands during the day committed brutal crimes at night, and Richard, hungry for money and eager for control, drifted naturally toward that world. His entry into the underworld didn't begin with a formal invitation. It began with the insult. One afternoon, while hanging around a pool hall, a small-time gangster named Charlie Lane mocked Richard in front of a crowd. Lane was older, well-connected, and used to scaring younger guys into submission. He didn't realize he was dealing with someone who lacked the most basic instinct that keeps people alive: fear. Richard went home, stewed over the humiliation, and then made a decision. Late that night, he tracked Lane's car, waited for him to come out of a bar, and beat him so brutally with a thick piece of wood that the man's own associates barely recognized him afterward. Richard didn't care who Lane knew. He didn't care about consequences. What mattered was that someone who had embarrassed him had paid for it. Word spread almost immediately. People whispered about the quiet kid who nearly killed a connected guy and didn't even flinch. In the criminal world, that was impressive. Not stupid, not reckless, but admirable. Fearlessness was currency, and Richard had a fortune. Soon, small-time mob guys began testing him. They'd ask him to deliver messages, then to deliver threats, then to take care of certain problems. Richard never asked questions, never hesitated. He was the perfect tool, loyal only to the job, never the person. He started with simple tasks: collecting debts, roughing up gamblers who didn't pay, driving packages from one location to another. Jobs that required muscle, not brains, but his employers noticed something unusual. Richard didn't just intimidate people, he intimidated everyone. Debtors paid instantly, rivals backed down, some even fled town. The quiet young man with the empty eyes was far more terrifying than men twice his age. And then came a night that changed the trajectory of his life forever. Richard had been asked to collect money from a local man who had fallen behind on payments. When Richard knocked, the man tried to bluff, claiming he didn't have the money, that he needed more time. Something inside Richard snapped. Instead of threatening him, he grabbed the man and threw him down a flight of stairs, breaking his neck instantly. There was a moment of complete silence. No yelling, no panic, just the soft hum of a refrigerator and the realization that yet another life had ended at his hands. Richard checked the man's pockets, took the cash he did have, wiped down the doorknob, and walked out calmly. The man's debt was now considered settled. This was the moment organized crime decided Richard was more than just muscle. He was someone useful, someone efficient, someone who could solve problems permanently. Soon the Mafia began calling him for more serious work. At first, Richard didn't realize the significance of these offers, but the pattern was clear. These weren't random street thugs asking for favors. These were soldiers and associates of the DeCavalcante family, the New Jersey branch of the American Mafia, a direct line into the world of professional killers, and Richard passed every silent test they threw his way. He didn't talk too much, he didn't brag, he didn't lose his temper. Most importantly, he had no hesitation when violence was required. mafia leaders saw something rare in him, a man who could kill cleanly, efficiently, and with no emotional residue. But Richard wasn't a typical recruit. He lacked the one quality the mafia valued above almost everything else: loyalty. Richard didn't care about family or honor or tradition. He cared about one thing only: respect. And in his world, respect didn't come from words or titles. It came from fear. When he realized that killing earned him that fear quicker than anything else, he leaned into it. Every job became an opportunity to sharpen his skills. He studied how people moved, how they reacted, where they were vulnerable. He learned to stalk his victims for hours without being noticed, to strike fast, to strike silently, to disappear. Killing didn't bother him. It didn't burden him. If anything, it brought him a strange peace. The underworld loved men like that. Within a few years, Richard had a reputation. One whispered quietly in bars and back rooms, "There's this kid from Jersey, big guy, quiet. If he comes for you, it's already too late." But Richard wasn't just becoming a killer, he was becoming a professional, and the mafia had taken notice. Soon, he would be introduced to a man whose offer would change his entire life, a man who would pull Richard fully into the world of contract killing, a man who would teach him methods that even the darkest criminals hesitated to use. That man's name would be Roy DeMeo. Richard's name was no longer confined to Jersey's pool halls or dark alleyways. By the late 1950s, whispers about a silent, towering Polish kid who killed without hesitation began circling the outer edges of organized crime. Those whispers eventually reached a man whose own reputation was built on blood: Roy DeMeo. Roy wasn't simply a mobster, he was a master of violence, a man who turned murder into mechanical precision. His crew was feared across Brooklyn for making bodies vanish with chilling efficiency. Victims disappeared into basements, were carved into pieces, dissolved, burned, buried, forgotten. DeMeo didn't trust easily, and he certainly didn't recruit amateurs. He wanted men who were calm under pressure, emotionally vacant, and obedient. When he heard about Richard, he wanted to see if the rumors were true. Their first encounter wasn't loud or dramatic. It happened in the back of a Brooklyn bar heavy with stale cigarette smoke. Half a dozen hardened killers watched Richard with cold eyes, waiting to see fear or hesitation. But Richard gave them nothing. He sat, still, posture straight, heartbeat steady. When Roy spoke, Richard answered directly without trying to impress. He didn't brag, didn't posture, didn't look around nervously. He was simply blank, and that blankness fascinated Roy. When the conversation ended, Roy slid a small photograph across the table, a middle-aged man in a blue jacket. No explanation beyond a simple instruction: he has to go. Richard didn't ask why or how. He only nodded once. The test had begun. Over the next 2 days, Richard watched the man like a predator learning his prey's routine. There was no emotional conflict, no rush of fear or guilt, just cold observation. One night, when the man stepped outside his apartment, Richard walked up behind him, aimed the gun, and fired a single shot into the back of his head. The body collapsed silently. Richard wiped the handle clean, put the weapon away, and walked off as though nothing had happened. The next day, he simply told Roy, "It's done." No story, no details, just the result. Roy didn't need anything more. The rumors had been true. This man wasn't merely dangerous, he was built for killing. After that, Roy began giving him regular assignments: enforcing debts, collecting money, intimidating shop owners, and eventually more contract hits. For the first time, Richard was working for someone who understood his abilities. And as the work intensified, something inside him shifted. The more he killed, the clearer his mind felt. Violence became a form of release, almost therapeutic. Unlike other hitmen who grew reckless or emotional, Richard remained impossible to read. He did not tremble, did not panic, did not second-guess himself. He killed quickly, worked alone, and vanished without a trace. His discipline impressed Roy, who warned him that one mistake in this life could mean execution by the very people paying him. Richard listened, but already understood the rules. Survival depended on silence, obedience, and precision, 3 qualities he had mastered since childhood. Working with Roy's crew wasn't easy. Many of his men were volatile, paranoid, unpredictable. They tried provoking Richard, pushing him, insulting him, mocking his heritage. They wanted to see a reaction, any sign of fear or anger. Instead, Richard remained stone-faced. It bothered them, even scared them. Roy eventually stepped in and told his crew to leave Richard alone. He wasn't like them. He wasn't driven by ego or impulse. He was something colder, something they couldn't understand. A tool sharpened to perfection that Roy knew he could rely on. Richard's reputation spread quietly at first. A nameless figure who arrived out of nowhere, completed a hit with surgical accuracy, and disappeared before the body hit the ground. No conversation, no emotion, no mistakes. Soon mobsters started referring to him as a ghost, someone who killed but was never seen, never heard, never suspected. Richard liked the anonymity. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't seeking power. The work itself gave him a sense of control he had never felt growing up. In a world filled with men who acted out of pride or anger, Richard stood apart because he didn't feel much of anything at all. But beneath the calm exterior, something darker grew. Richard believed he was becoming untouchable, a weapon that could never backfire. What he didn't realize yet was that the deeper he stepped into Roy DeMeo's world, the more he was binding himself to a life ruled by paranoia, betrayal, and blood. Roy's approval came with an invisible cost, and every job Richard completed pulled him one step closer to a future he couldn't escape. He didn't know it yet, but he was being shaped into something far more terrifying than a street enforcer. He was becoming a professional killer, one of the most feared in the American underworld, and the transformation had only just begun. Richard's partnership with Roy deepened quickly, and soon the assignments grew darker, more complex, and far more violent. What began as simple executions evolved into calculated, carefully coordinated murders that required a level of discipline few men possessed. Roy trusted him in a way he trusted almost no one. Everyone else in the organization had tempers, addictions, weaknesses, or vulnerabilities that could expose them. Richard, however, moved through every job with a chilling calm. He never drank on the job, never asked questions, and never bragged afterward. The absence of emotion made him invaluable and terrifying. Roy's crew, meanwhile, spiraled further into chaos. They partied hard, talked too much, and sometimes acted without orders. Their carelessness created problems that Roy needed Richard to fix. That meant more bodies, more disappearances, more cleanup. Richard didn't mind. He didn't see murder as a moral decision. To him, it was simply a task, something that needed to be done for money, respect, or survival. Growing up under the violent rule of his father had taught him that life had little value. Now he applied that belief professionally, removing obstacles with the same emotion one might use to crush a bug. Over time, Richard began taking on assignments completely alone. He preferred it that way. The fewer people involved, the fewer mistakes. He spent hours observing a target, understanding their habits, their weaknesses, their routines. A man might think he was living a normal day, while Richard sat silently in a parked car nearby, memorizing every detail. He studied the rhythm of his victims' lives so he could end them at the right moment with minimal noise and maximum efficiency. He didn't improvise unless absolutely necessary. He planned, he watched, he waited. It wasn't long before the Mafia began handing him contracts from outside DeMeo's circle. The Gambino family wanted his services, then the Genovese family. Soon, word had spread to groups across Philadelphia, Newark, and even parts of Boston. They all wanted the same thing, a man who could kill without hesitation and without being linked back to them. Richard's outsider status actually worked in his favor. Because he wasn't Italian, He could never be officially made, but that also made him free. He could work for anyone, take any job, and disappear afterward. He wasn't tied to one family, which made him uniquely dangerous. By this time, Richard had killed so many people that the memories blurred together. Faces, names, locations, they became fragments. He wasn't counting, he wasn't journaling, he wasn't collecting trophies. The victims were simply tasks completed. What mattered to him wasn't the person, it was the result, and with each kill, he grew more confident in his ability to control life and death. That feeling, power, became intoxicating in a way that frightened even him when he reflected on it. But those reflections were brief. Richard didn't dwell on morality or consequences. He buried those thoughts the same way he buried bodies. He also learned to adapt his methods to avoid detection. Guns were clean but loud. Knives were quiet but messy. Blunt instruments required close proximity, which increased risk. Richard wanted precision, consistency, and control, so he began experimenting. Cyanide came into his life like a revelation, a toxic substance that could kill in seconds, leave minimal trace, and be administered in countless ways. Through the nose, in food, in drinks, in a quick injection disguised as a bump from a passerby. Cyanide was invisible, unexpected, and perfect for hitmen who didn't want attention. Once he mastered dosage, he felt invincible. Still, for all his professional discipline, Richard's personal life remained a contradiction. He tried living a normal existence outside of crime, especially after meeting Barbara, the young woman who would become his wife. She saw only the quiet, polite, protective side of him. The monster inside stayed hidden beneath neatly pressed shirts and a calm demeanor. He held her hand gently, smiled softly, and appeared to be a man devoted to family. To neighbors, he was the nice guy who shoveled snow from their driveways. No one saw the inner storm, the violent impulses simmering just beneath the surface. His growing family gave him a sense of normalcy he had never experienced, but it came at a cost. Richard struggled to balance the two identities, the loving husband and father versus the stone-cold killer who vanished at odd hours with no explanation. When he came home from a murder, he would wash his hands, change his clothes, walk into the living room, and kiss his children on the head as if nothing had happened. He convinced himself that he wasn't hurting them, that he was providing, that the money justified everything. He built a suburban facade so convincing that even Barbara remained unaware of the darkness hidden in the basement of his life. But the double life was taking a toll. Murder had become easy, too easy. It soothed him, it calmed him. Each kill chipped away at the remaining fragments of his humanity. And yet he needed more. He needed new methods, new techniques, new ways to make a victim disappear without leaving a trace. He wanted to perfect the craft. He wanted to be the best. And with Roy DeMeo encouraging him, pushing him and praising him, Richard slowly began crossing lines he didn't even realize existed. The man who once killed only when bullied or ordered was evolving into something far more dangerous. A man who could kill simply because he felt like it. The transformation was nearly complete, and the world around him had no idea that a silent predator was roaming freely through their neighborhoods. Richard's world continued to expand, but with that expansion came a darkness even he struggled to fully acknowledge. Violence had rooted itself into his identity so deeply that it no longer required a reason. In the early years, he justified murder as survival or work. Now it had become something far more instinctive. He didn't seek opportunities, yet when conflict arose, even something as small as a disrespectful comment, it triggered a cold, instinctive urge to eliminate the problem permanently. People who crossed him didn't just anger him, they ignited something primal, something waiting for release. The streets of New Jersey began whispering his name, though never publicly. Criminals, hustlers, dealers, and bookmakers all carried the silent understanding that there was a towering figure in their midst, one who never bluffed, never hesitated, never missed. When trouble emerged, men spoke quietly. "Don't let him hear you. Kuklinski doesn't forget. Even without seeking attention, Richard became a shadow woven into the underworld structure. Mobsters admired him, thugs feared him, outsiders avoided him. But beneath the admiration lay something else, unease. Richard was too calm, too controlled, too willing. Even seasoned hitmen sensed danger around him, a presence that didn't operate by normal rules. Roy DeMeo, for all his brutality, recognized this evolution and welcomed it. He pushed Richard harder, giving him more complicated jobs. Hits in daylight, hits in crowded spaces, hits on men who knew assassination was coming. Richard thrived in these situations. He had an uncanny ability to become invisible in plain sight. He blended into crowds, waited with unnatural patience, and acted only when the perfect moment presented itself. His victims rarely saw him coming. Many didn't even know they were dead until their bodies hit the ground. Each successful job strengthened his confidence and expanded his techniques. But with every new murder, a subtle shift began happening inside him. He found himself analyzing pain, studying the fear in his victims' eyes, observing how different methods affected the body. He didn't feel empathy or remorse, only curiosity. This curiosity evolved into experimentation. Cyanide became one of his favorite tools. The quiet efficiency of poison fascinated him. It allowed him to kill without touching, without alerting anyone, without creating memorable scenes. A pinch in food, a spray on a steering wheel, a needle hidden in a handshake. There were endless possibilities, and Richard explored them all with clinical precision. Despite the emotional numbness that guided his violence, Richard maintained the illusion of a normal life. Barbara believed she had married a hard-working trucker. She had no idea that the late-night shifts, the phone calls in coded language, or the unexplained stacks of cash came from murder contracts. Richard protected his family fiercely. He bought them a nice home, filled their holidays with presents, cooked meals, and played the role of attentive husband and father. In those moments, he seemed almost tender, but the tenderness was temporary and fragile. The smallest inconvenience could shatter it. Barbara sometimes unknowingly walked straight into Richard's triggers, and when she did, the quiet, loving man she knew would instantly morph into someone violent, someone she couldn't reason with, someone who looked at her the same way he looked at a target, without emotion. Still, Barbara stayed, partly out of fear, partly because she wanted to believe the man who held her hand was the real Richard, the one capable of kindness. She did not know that kindness for Richard was simply another mask. Meanwhile, Richard began working beyond DeMeo's assignments. He was a freelancer now, drifting between crime families who paid well for quiet assassinations. He traveled across state lines, sometimes driving hundreds of miles to carry out a hit in places where no one knew his face. In motel rooms and rental cars, he meticulously prepared his equipment, studied maps, and rehearsed exits. His work became a ritual. He started documenting techniques in his memory. How long someone could live with a bullet above the ear, how quickly cyanide took effect depending on the dosage, how to cut tendons cleanly so a body could be folded into a drum. These weren't trophies, they were lessons. He saw murder as a craft, and he was becoming a master. The criminal world noticed. His reputation spread to men who had never met him. Some called him a ghost, others called him a machine, but one nickname began circulating quietly among criminals who didn't know his real identity: the Iceman. Not because he froze bodies, those stories would come later, but because he seemed incapable of human warmth. He killed with the detachment of a surgeon and the precision of a sniper. Men in the underworld began telling each other, if he looks at you without blinking, run. Yet beneath this cold exterior, another danger grew. Richard believed he could get away with anything, and in the world he occupied, that belief was fatal. Men who feel untouchable stop, noticing warning signs. They stop trusting their instincts. They take risks they shouldn't. Richard was drifting toward that edge without realizing it. The more murders he completed, the more invisible he felt. He wasn't aware yet, but law enforcement had begun noticing patterns: sudden disappearances, unsolved homicides, killings that left almost no evidence. Richard didn't know it yet, but his reign of invisibility was shifting. His mastery of murder wasn't just making him powerful, it was making him visible to the wrong people. And while he traveled deeper into the world of contract killing, the first threads of his eventual downfall had already begun tightening around him, silently, patiently, just as he had done with so many victims before. Richard's work continued to pull him deeper into the shadows, and the shadows welcomed him. By now he was traveling regularly, sometimes for assigned hits, sometimes simply to disappear for a few days and reset his mind. He had grown comfortable slipping in and out of different identities, different towns, different lives. People came and went, bodies appeared and vanished, and Richard remained a quiet ghost carving his path through America's criminal underworld. Yet despite the unpredictability of his schedule, his home life remained strangely consistent. Every morning he woke up beside Barbara, had breakfast with his children, kissed them on the forehead before heading out. To the neighbors, he was the proud father who bought his kids bicycles, hosted barbecues, cracked jokes at holidays, and always kept his yard tidy. The contrast between the gentle suburban man and the ruthless murderer was so stark that no one who saw him mowing his lawn could have imagined the same hands had ended dozens of lives. But the cracks were forming, small at first, but growing. Barbara noticed Richard often returned home with a stiffness in his shoulders, a darkness in his eyes, and a strange, lingering smell on his clothes: gunpowder, sweat, chemicals he claimed came from warehouses or job sites. He always provided explanations, short and sharp, delivered with a glare that discouraged further questions. Barbara wasn't foolish. She suspected he was involved in crime. But murder, torture, international contracts, that was territory she couldn't even process, let alone imagine. Richard's fascination with methods of killing expanded during these years. He watched documentaries about wildlife, studying how animals hunted. He observed how predators stalked silently before attacking, how venom worked, how certain creatures immobilized their prey before feeding. These programs sparked new ideas he adapted for human targets. Cyanide had become his signature, but he continued experimenting, mixing it with different solutions, testing absorption rates, learning how to kill without leaving a trace. When he shared these discoveries with Roy DeMeo, even Roy, hardened as he was, looked at Richard with a mix of awe and unease. Richard also began developing a sixth sense about danger, an instinct built from decades of abuse, street fights, gang wars, and underworld dealings. He could feel when someone was lying, when he was being followed, when a setup was forming. That instinct saved his life more than once. Men who tried to ambush him always underestimated his alertness. He didn't just look at a person. He studied posture, breath patterns, eye movement. He could sense tension before it manifested, and when danger approached, he reacted instantly and without hesitation. His size, strength, and calmness under pressure made him nearly impossible to overpower. The mob knew this. That's why they kept giving him contracts. He was reliable, efficient, completely silent. He didn't get drunk and talk. He didn't brag. He didn't show off. He didn't demand special treatment. He simply took the job, completed it, and returned with his payment. If there was one thing the mob valued more than loyalty, it was capability. Richard had both, or so they believed, but loyalty in Richard's world had limits. He didn't kill for honor or respect. He killed for money, necessity, or impulse. He followed orders because it benefited him, not because he felt allegiance to any family. And deep down, most mob bosses understood that made him dangerous. A man who kills for principles can be predicted. A man who kills for instinct cannot. During these years, Richard performed some of his cleanest, most technically flawless hits. One man died of an apparent heart attack at a crowded restaurant. Another collapsed while walking his dog in a suburban neighborhood. A third died inside a club full of witnesses, none of whom noticed the quick hand movement that delivered the fatal dose. Richard didn't even linger to watch them fall anymore. He killed and walked away, vanishing before the rest of the world caught up with what had happened. But his precision was not without flaws. For all his discipline, Richard's greatest weakness remained his temper. A single traffic dispute, a rude comment, or a disrespectful gesture could ignite him instantly. These unplanned killings were risky, sloppy, and unnecessary. Yet Richard justified them to himself as lessons. He firmly believed that the world needed strong men to keep order, and he appointed himself one of those enforcers. His random violence created scattered clues, bodies that didn't fit mob patterns, murders with no motive, victims whose only crime was being in Richard's path at the wrong moment. Detectives in New Jersey and New York took note of these strange cases. Nothing connected them, but detectives whispered among themselves about a phantom killer, a single individual who could be responsible for multiple unexplained deaths. They called him that ghost. No one had a name, no one had a description, just a feeling. An invisible executioner was moving through their streets. Meanwhile, Richard's involvement with Roy DeMeo intensified. The two men, though vastly different, understood each other in ways others couldn't. Roy was theatrical, impulsive, cruel in a loud way. Richard was quiet, methodical, internally driven. They were two different faces of the same darkness. Roy often bragged about their work, while Richard remained silent and focused. That difference created tension at times, but Roy trusted him more than any other hitman, and Richard tolerated Roy because he provided steady, profitable work. Then came the shift. Roy's world began collapsing. Investigations, surveillance, informants. The FBI dug deeper into the DeMeo crew. The Gambino family grew uneasy. Rumors swirled that Roy was becoming a liability. Richard saw the signs long before Roy did. He noticed the paranoia in Roy's eyes, the agitation in his tone, the way he started talking too much and too loudly. Richard had seen many men unravel before. He could sense when one was approaching the end, and as Roy's empire fractured, Richard quietly prepared himself for what he knew would eventually be required. In the underworld, there were only two fates for men like Roy: prison or death. And when the mob wanted someone gone, they often chose a familiar face to carry out the job. Richard understood this truth long before Roy did, and he knew with cold certainty that one day he might have to eliminate the very man who had once helped build his career. That moment was coming closer than anyone realized. The signs of Roy's unraveling were subtle at first: missed meetings, restless pacing, abrupt changes in conversation. But Richard noticed everything. He always had. Roy had built his reputation on violence and intimidation, but beneath the bravado, he was a fragile structure held together by cocaine, fear, and ego. The FBI had tightened its grip around his empire, and those he once commanded with absolute authority were now whispering behind his back, distancing themselves, preparing for the inevitable collapse. Richard watched the transformation quietly, knowing full well what happened to men in Roy's position. Roy began talking too much. He shared details he once guarded. He boasted loudly, almost desperately, as if trying to remind the world of who he was. Richard understood that behavior for what it truly signaled: panic. When dangerous men grew desperate, they became unpredictable. That unpredictability was more deadly than any weapon. Richard kept a careful distance, maintaining the illusion of trust without giving Roy an opportunity to pull him into the chaos. Despite the growing tension, Roy continued assigning him work, but the jobs felt different now. Sloppier, more rushed, less thought out. Roy needed bodies gone, debts recovered, loose ends tightened, and he demanded it quickly, as if speed alone could keep the FBI at bay. Richard disliked rushed work, but he accepted the contracts, completing them with his usual precision, while Roy spiraled further into paranoia. The more Roy unraveled, the more he leaned on Richard, asking him to accompany him on errands, drop-ins, collections, tasks Roy once enjoyed doing himself. Richard saw the shift for what it was. Roy no longer trusted his own men. Many of them spent their nights high, volatile and talkative. Some whispered that Roy was becoming reckless. Others feared they might be next victims of his unpredictability. When loyalty cracked, survival instincts took over. People who once toasted drinks with Roy now avoided his gaze. Still, Roy tried to maintain his old swagger. He carried himself like a king who believed his throne was unshakable. But the sleepless eyes, trembling hands, and sudden rage fits revealed the truth. His world was collapsing one brick at a time. Richard had seen this exact pattern in other men who were killed by their own families for much less. And he knew the Mafia wasn't known for second chances, especially not when it came to liabilities. It was during this time that Richard began making mental calculations, not of money, not of assignments, but of outcomes. Roy's downfall wasn't just possible, it was guaranteed. The only question was when and how. And in the underworld, when a man like Roy fell, those closest to him often fell with him. Richard refused to be one of them. He kept his emotions sealed, his words brief, his intentions hidden behind a calm exterior that made him unreadable, even to Roy. But Roy's paranoia sharpened. At times he stared at Richard too long, searching for betrayal in a face that revealed nothing. At other times he clung to Richard's presence, as if believing Richard alone could protect him from the storm closing in. Their conversations grew shorter, colder. Roy would ask probing questions. Richard answered with vague, harmless phrases. He sensed Roy testing him, trying to decide if Richard was a friend or a threat. But Richard gave him nothing to hold on to. No loyalty, no fear, no emotion. Meanwhile, Richard's personal life remained eerily steady. To Barbara and the children, he was still the quiet father who came home with groceries, fixed broken shelves, and tucked the kids into bed. His duality had become so perfected that he could step from a murder scene into his living room without leaving a trace of the transformation. But beneath his composed exterior, a subtle exhaustion lingered, a weariness from balancing so many masks. His ability to remain invisible depended on discipline, and Roy's unraveling threatened to drag him into a spotlight he had avoided his entire life. As months passed, Roy's world shrank. The FBI watched him. The Gambino bosses discussed him in hushed tones. Informants whispered about him with fear. Tension thickened around him like a choking fog. And then came the rumors that the family was considering eliminating him. No one dared say it openly, but the streets felt it, the way animals sense a storm before the first clap of thunder. Richard heard these whispers too, and deep inside, he knew exactly how the Mafia handled men who had become liabilities. They didn't hire outsiders, they didn't use amateurs, they hired someone who wouldn't hesitate, someone they trusted, someone whose work left no mess, no noise, no trace, and that someone was him. Richard didn't flinch at the idea. There was no emotional conflict, no moral hesitation. Roy had been useful, and Richard had done his job in return. But usefulness in the Mafia was temporary. When the balance tipped, the decision was simple. Richard had always expected their relationship to end exactly this way. He didn't relish the idea, but he didn't dread it either. It was simply another assignment waiting to happen. Still, he watched Roy carefully, waiting for the inevitable moment when the order would come. He noticed how Roy twitched at shadows, how he jumped when phones rang, how he snapped at allies and begged for reassurances in the same breath. The once feared DeMeo now looked haunted by his crimes, his enemies, and the realization that he was losing control of everything he once dominated. One night, as they sat together in a dimly lit garage discussing business, Richard saw it clearly. Roy had crossed a threshold. His eyes were hollow, his hands trembled, his voice wavered, his mind was slipping. He rambled about betrayal, about men plotting against him, about nightmares that felt too real. He looked at Richard, perhaps searching for comfort, perhaps searching for treachery. What he found was neither. Richard simply nodded, listening silently, already sensing how close the end was. And somewhere in the cold, quiet corners of Richard's mind, a realization took shape. The man who had once taught him the darkest rules of the underworld would soon be a chapter in his past, not his future. The wheels were turning. The decision had been made, even if Roy didn't know it yet. The walls around Roy tightened so quietly that he didn't notice the final inch of freedom disappearing, but Richard noticed. He could sense when a man was being measured for death. It was in the way others spoke softer around him, in the way conversations ended abruptly when he walked into a room, in the way even the boldest members of the crew avoided eye contact. The Gambino hierarchy had already made its decision. They just hadn't said it out loud. That was the Mafia's way. Death sentences were silent until the moment a gun pressed against your skull. Richard waited, patient and detached, as he had been trained by life itself. He didn't ask questions, didn't look for signs, didn't pry for details. He simply watched Roy crumble under the weight of his own paranoia. Once a man begins to fear his own shadow, the end is inevitable. And when a man like Roy fears you, it becomes a matter of time before he tries something desperate. Richard remained calm, almost eerily so, keeping his movements predictable and his demeanor steady, knowing that any sudden shift could provoke Roy into doing something reckless. The official order came quietly, the way these things always did. A few words spoken by the right man at the right time. No theatrics, no drama. Just a simple instruction with the finality of a guillotine blade. Roy had become a liability. He needed to be removed. And of all the men they could have chosen, only one made sense. Only one had both the skill and the emotional emptiness required. Richard didn't react when the order was given. He felt no satisfaction, no regret, no hesitation. Roy had been useful. Now he wasn't. That was the underworld's most fundamental rule. The next time Richard saw him, Roy didn't seem like a man who knew death was near. In fact, he spoke too casually, too quickly, as if trying to fill the silence that now frightened him. His hands were restless, his eyes darted around the room. Richard watched quietly, studying him the same way he studied every target, examining posture, tone, vulnerability. Roy rambled about unfinished business, about people betraying him, about loyalty he felt slipping away. But he never suspected that his greatest threat was standing just a few feet away, listening without emotion. When the moment came, it came without ceremony. Richard didn't drag the moment out or create drama. That wasn't his style. A hit was a job, nothing more. And Roy, for all his past cruelty and influence, was simply another task to complete. Alone in a quiet room, Richard raised the gun and fired. The shock in Roy's eyes lasted only a second before the life drained from them. No last words, no attempts at negotiation, just silence. A silence so deep it felt like the world itself exhaled. Richard didn't linger. He carried the body to Roy's Cadillac, placed it in the trunk, and shut the lid with finality. A lamp from the back seat slid onto the corpse, an insignificant detail that would later become part of the legend whispered in the shadows. Richard walked away calmly, as he had done countless times before. He felt no triumph, no sorrow, not even relief. To him, Roy had simply reached the end of his usefulness. The job was finished. The world moved on. After Roy's death, Richard didn't expect grief, but what struck him was the eerie quiet that followed. Men who once boasted loudly about their association with Roy suddenly fell silent. His once feared crew scattered like insects exposed to light. Some hid, some fled, some were killed. The empire Roy had built with blood and brutality disintegrated in less than a week. And in that collapse, Richard found himself standing alone again. No crew, no leader, no one to answer to. But being alone never frightened him. If anything, solitude made him more effective. Without Roy's chaotic influence or impulsive demands, Richard's work became even more precise. He accepted contracts selectively, approached each one with cold calculation, and disappeared, afterward without leaving a trace. His reputation grew not only because of his brutality, but because of his consistency. In a world filled with unpredictable men, Richard was unnervingly stable. Clients valued that. They wanted results, not theatrics. Still, a subtle shift was happening beneath the surface, one Richard didn't fully grasp. Every murder he committed, every life he ended, left a thin thread behind. Individually, those threads were invisible, but over time, they connected, forming a web that stretched across states, across agencies, across victims' families. The law didn't yet know his name, but investigators were beginning to see patterns. Patterns no one else recognized because they were too scattered, too spread out, too clean. But the cleanest patterns always reveal themselves eventually. And while Richard continued killing with the confidence of a man who believed he could outsmart fate, the first small cracks in his invincibility began forming. Cracks created not by enemies, but by something much more dangerous. Arrogance, routine, and a few careless choices he never imagined would matter. His downfall was no longer a distant possibility. It was beginning to take shape, piece by piece, quietly, just as he had once moved through the world. Richard's confidence had grown into something close to mythology. He believed he operated outside the reach of ordinary men, beyond the boundaries of law and consequence. And for a long time, he was right. His jobs were clean, his movements calculated, his presence untraceable. Victims disappeared without leaving a ripple on the surface of society. Bodies were found miles apart, states apart, years apart, each one seemingly unrelated. There was no pattern the human eye could see, but the human eye wasn't the only one watching anymore. By the mid-1980s, investigative techniques were evolving, behavioral science units were forming, data sharing between states was improving. Cold cases were being reopened, reanalyzed, reconnected. A few detectives in New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania began noticing similarities. The same type of wounds, the same chemical burns on bodies, the same methods of disposal. It wasn't enough for a case, but it was enough to make them suspicious. Enough to convince them that someone powerful, organized, and disturbingly skilled was working behind the scenes. While investigators quietly built their theories, Richard's personal life drifted into more dangerous territory. His marriage, once the only part of his life not dripping in violence, began to fracture. Arguments turned into shouting matches. Fear replaced affection. His wife noticed the unpredictability, the coldness, the moments where Richard seemed to disappear inside his own mind. Sometimes he stared at her with a dead stillness that frightened her more than anger ever could. His children felt it too, a distance, a tension, a presence that made them tiptoe in their own home. But even as the family sensed the danger, Richard convinced himself he was in control. He held tightly to the illusion that he could separate both worlds, the loving father who smiled at Christmas photos and the silent executioner who left bodies in freezers or deep in the woods. He believed he could maintain that balance forever, but a life built on compartmentalized lies is not a life, it's a slow collapse. The turning point came from a man Richard considered more annoying than dangerous, Phil Solimene. Phil was not a genius, not a strategist, not even a reliable criminal, but he was a talker, and talkers eventually talk to the wrong people. Phil betrayed Richard not with violence, but with a handshake, the kind done across a government table, under fluorescent lights, with a hidden tape recorder nearby. What began as quiet suspicions soon transformed into a targeted operation. Undercover agents moved in closer, learning Richard's patterns, his schedule, the locations he preferred for business. They watched him meet potential clients, observed his cold demeanor, his detached conversations, but they needed proof, undeniable proof, because men like Richard didn't go down from rumors, they went down from precision. And so the trap was built. An undercover agent posed as a man seeking Richard's services. Not a violent confrontation, not a risky sting, just a conversation designed to gather the one thing investigators never had from him, a direct admission. Richard, confident as ever, explained his methods with unsettling calm. How he waited, how he tracked, how he disposed of bodies. He spoke not like a man confessing, but like a craftsman describing his work. He didn't realize each word was sealing his fate. When the day of his arrest arrived, Richard didn't sense danger. He didn't look over his shoulder. He had no idea dozens of agents were positioned around him, weapons ready, waiting for the signal. In his mind, this was just another routine errand, another quiet day, another meeting, another lie he would tell his wife when he got home. The moment his car was blocked in, the world snapped into slow motion. Voices shouted commands, doors slammed, footsteps thundered around him. For the first time in decades, Richard felt something unfamiliar. Not fear exactly, but something close to shock. He stepped out of the car slowly, hands raised, the cold air biting at his skin. The unstoppable force had finally been stopped. Inside the interrogation room, he maintained his composure. He denied everything at first, but the evidence was overwhelming. Tapes, photos, testimonies, patterns. For every story he tried to bury, investigators had already dug a hole and filled it with proof. The man who once believed he could outsmart fate now sat chained to a metal chair, realizing that his silence could no longer save him. His trial was a spectacle. Journalists filled the hallways, cameras flashed, people whispered the nickname that had begun circulating, the Iceman, a name that described not just his method, but his soul, or the absence of one. His demeanor in court was disturbingly calm, almost clinical. He didn't beg, he didn't cry, he didn't show remorse. He simply existed, the way he always had, separated from the emotions of ordinary men. He was sentenced to multiple life terms, enough years to erase any possibility of freedom. Yet prison didn't break him. In many ways, it made him more talkative. Interviewers came from across the country, fascinated by the contrast between his quiet demeanor and his monstrous crimes. He described killings with the same tone a man might use to describe a shopping list: emotionless, detached, precise. But time, even for the coldest men, has a way of softening the edges. In his later years, Richard began questioning himself, his choices, his violence, the lies he constructed to justify the life he lived. For the first time, he wondered if his brutality had been a choice or an inheritance from a childhood carved in pain. His reflections didn't erase his crimes, but they revealed something haunting, a lifetime spent believing that strength meant silence, that survival required darkness. In March of 2006, the man who once seemed invincible succumbed to illness behind prison walls. No crowds gathered, no empire crumbled, no underworld figure mourned. His death was quiet, unceremonious. The final chapter for a man who had spent his life writing tragedies in the dark. Yet his story endures, not because of the crimes he committed, but because of the question that lingers long after the final word. How does a child born into fear grow into one of the most feared men in America? Is evil created, or is it shaped piece by piece by the world that raises us? Maybe that's the part of Richard Kuklinski's story that haunts us the most. Not the murders, not the coldness, not the violence, but the realization that monsters are not born fully formed. They are built.